In this particular video, I'd like to introduce the hormones of the pituitary gland and then start going over them. I'm not going to be able to cover all of them in one video just because this is a pretty large piece of information. So I will start this and then just continue it in more videos. So the pituitary hormones. Just a little bit of new terminology here. Trophic and tropes. Essentially, these are the term trophic, basically, when we use this word to describe a hormone, we're saying that hormone basically controls another, another tissue. Okay, and what the trophic hormones of the pituitary gland tend to do, especially the anterior pituitary gland, what they do is they essentially increase the metabolic activity of their target tissue. So basically, now there's only one hormone of the anterior pituitary that does, well, I mean, of the pituitary in general, that doesn't flat out regulate the activity of another gland. Okay, I guess antidiuretic hormone, I guess there's two. All right, but for example, let's go with the example of thyroid stimulating hormone. Okay, so basically the trophic hormones of the pituitary, what they do is they regulate the activity of other glands. Okay, so for example, if we're in a situation where we need to increase our BMR, our basal metabolic rate, basically remember our caloric burn when we're resting, how many calories we burn when we're not active just in our everyday life, like the equivalent of turning your car on and letting it idle. Okay, if we want to increase the rate at which we burn calories, or our metabolism, what we would do is we would want to get more T3 and T4 into our system, thyroid hormones. Okay, and that's the number one function of thyroid hormones, is to increase our metabolic rate. Okay, so what the pituitary gland is going to do when the situation is right is it's going to squirt out some thyroid stimulating hormone into the bloodstream. That hormone, that hormone will go to the thyroid gland. Okay, and then what's going to happen is this hormone is going to bind to, it's going to bind to its, respective receptors on the thyroid gland, and what it's going to do is it's going to increase the size and activity of the cells of the thyroid, which we'll talk about more in depth when I get to the thyroid gland video itself. Okay, so essentially what this is doing is it's increasing the cellular machinery that's used to make thyroid hormone. And you guys know, the nucleus, the endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi, and all the organelles that are involved in protein synthesis are going to increase in size and activity. And then in turn, the cells are going to, they're going to increase their production of T3 and T4. Then they're going to increase their output, or secretion, of T3 and T4, which in turn will increase our basal metabolic rate. And then, being that this is a negative feedback mechanism, once T3 and T4 levels get up to where we need them to be, the secretion of TSH will stop, and then when we reach the desired metabolic rate that we need. Okay, so you get the picture here. That's what a trophic hormone does. Okay, this is a hormone that's secreted that, its purpose is to basically, regulate or control the activity of that gland. And what the trophic hormones of the pituitary are going to do is increase the activity, increase the production of hormones of their glands, and also increase the secretion of those hormones. Okay. And then tropes, essentially, this is what I like to call them, these are the cells of the pituitary. Okay, the cells of the pituitary, more specifically the cells of the anterior pituitary, and the various cells are used to synthesize, i.e., manufacture and secrete the various hormones that are found in the pituitary, anterior pituitary. Okay, so a little bit of new terminology here. So keep this term trophic hormone in mind. All right, and I'm going to start out again in this video. I'm not going to get to the hormones of the posterior pituitary, but I'll mention them briefly in this video, but I'm not going to get into their functions and mechanics until another video rolls around. But the adeno hypothesis, remember, is the anterior pituitary. Okay, and the anterior pituitary consists of these tropes, or these cells that use to synthesize and secrete specific hormones. Okay, and the cells are very specific to the hormones that they produce. So, for example, there are actually, let's just talk about the hormones, and I'll mention the cells next. Okay, so the hormones of the adeno hypophysis, or the anterior pituitary, are going to be growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, prolactin, and these two hormones that are called gonadotropes, follicle stimulating and luteinizing hormone. Okay, luteinizing hormone. All right, so for example, these cells that are responsible for synthesizing growth hormone are called somatotropes. I'll talk about where that term comes from in a little while, because this is the hormone that I'm going to primarily focus on in this video. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, corticotropes, thyroid stimulating hormone, thyrotropes. You guys are getting the picture here. Prolactin, lactotropes. Okay, and gonadotropes are responsible for your gonadotropins. Okay, so you've been introduced to that term trope, or trophic. Okay, and again, we said that that's a hormone that is used to regulate the activity of other glands. Okay, by essentially increasing their activity and secretion of their respective hormones. Now you'll notice that these hormones are, that the cells are very closely named to the hormones that are produced as well. Okay, and growth hormone, I'll explain that one in a little while. All right. So, for example, and you remember in the previous video, we talked about how the anterior pituitary is regulated by the portal system, by the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. I always have a hard time saying that one. Sorry, folks. But again, remember that you've got your hypothalamus, and then you've got your posterior pituitary, and then you've got your anterior pituitary. Okay, and we said that the posterior pituitary is directly regulated by neurons from the hypothalamus. And remember the basic embryology of the anterior pituitary, that this originated from Rathke's pouch in the from the mucosal membranes of the nasopharynx. All right. So as a result, there's no direct neural connection, because remember, the posterior pituitary is just a downgrowth from the diencephalon, or the hypothalamus. And so as a result, what we have here is a portal system. Okay, remember, a portal system is two capillary beds connected together by a portal vein. Okay, so, and then you know that the hypothalamus is made up of various centers. Okay, and when we need to regulate or change some aspect of our physiology, all right, then one of these particular centers will be activated. It will squirt out this, what are called releasing hormones. Okay, into this first bed of capillaries. Then that blood will be circulated through the portal vein with the hormones in it into the second bed of capillaries. And then those particular releasing hormones will diffuse into the tissue space of the anterior pituitary. And remember, these are just like any other chemical messages. They are specific. They're specific, remember, the hormone receptor relationship that they have, like a lock and key relationship, very specific relationship. All right. And these releasing hormones will interact with, any one of these particular cells, depending on which type it is we're talking about, and then increase the activity of them. And then there are also inhibiting hormones that do the exact opposite. Okay. And, so these are the various hormones of the anterior pituitary, and the two hormones of the posterior pituitary would be what's called ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin, which again I will discuss more later on. Okay, so again, if you if you're at this point in time right now, make sure you go back and you watch the videos that I titled Endocrine Physiology and the Anatomy of the Pituitary Gland, so you can really understand and grasp everything that I was just talking about, because that was just a brief overview of a video I made just specifically to that topic. All right. So these are the hormones of the anterior pituitary. Now let's start getting into what they do. Okay, growth hormone, somatotropic hormone. Okay, now this is an interesting hormone because this is actually the only hormone of the anterior pituitary that does not exert its function directly on its target cells. Okay, so for example, the example I gave earlier of TSH and increasing our basal metabolic rate. Oops. Okay, you got to remember there's something in the middle here, the thyroid. Okay, so the pituitary increases our basal metabolic rate by increasing the activity of the thyroid, which will in turn squirt out its respective hormones, which increase our metabolism. Okay, this hormone, once it's squirted out into the bloodstream, I keep saying squirted, once it's secreted into the bloodstream, this hormone actually directly affects our tissues, okay? And the name says it all. Okay, the name says it all. This hormone stimulates growth. Okay, pretty straightforward. Now, what does this stimulate the growth of is the question. And the answer to that essentially is everything. Okay, in the early days when we were first trying to, well, not we as myself, but scientists, I should say, physiologists, endocrinologists, doctors, and so on, were studying the activities of growth hormone. They were, doing a lot of testing on mice and rats. So, for example, what they were showing is with rats that were, that were injected with growth hormone, essentially the rats grew in size. Okay, now what parts of them grew in size? Their musculoskeletal system, obviously, because when you think of growth, you think of growing in height and bulk, but also their organs also grew in size. So it's safe to say that growth hormone essentially affects the growth of, of all of our organs, okay? And, some more noticeable than others, for example, the liver, is, the activity of the liver is greatly affected by growth hormone. The activity of bones, muscles are greatly affected by this. Okay, well, like I said, all organs grew in size. All right, so growth hormone does what it does what it's supposed to do. It stimulates growth. Okay, so essentially what growth hormone does is it increases cell size and it increases the mitotic activity of cells. Okay, but that can't do that to all cells. Remember, muscles are amitotic. Okay, and being that muscles are amitotic, you know what the word, whenever you see the letter A in front of a word, that means without. Okay, so basically those are cells that are incapable of dividing. All right, so those cells have to grow through other means. Okay, so growth hormone not only increases the overall size of the cells by it, I should say, increases the size of the tissue by cell division. It can also increase the metabolic activity of the tissues that allows them to grow properly. Okay, because remember, in order for a cell to divide, it has to be large enough. And in order for the cell to be large enough, it has to have the right nourishments. And one of the main molecules that it's going to need is protein. Okay, so growth hormone has some pretty direct effects on the metabolism of cells. All right. Now, when it comes to the metabolic effects then that growth hormone exerts, essentially what it's safe to say that growth hormone has what we can say glucose sparing effects. Okay, growth hormone is very glucose sparing. Okay, so essentially what growth hormone does is it increases the rate of protein synthesis. Okay, growth hormone increases the rate of protein synthesis within cells. Okay, and essentially how it does this, in order to increase the rate of protein synthesis, is we have to, well, let's do this. Okay, in order to increase protein synthesis, growth hormone has to increase the transport of, I'm going to abbreviate this, amino acids into the cell. How exactly? Basically very similar to insulin. Basically insulin binds to its particular receptors, and then various gates find their way to the cell membrane, and then that allows the transport of these molecules into the cells. Okay, so in this regard, it's very similar to insulin. Okay, and I haven't talked about insulin yet, but you'll learn about it in another video. All right. So another way we can increase the rate of protein synthesis is to increase the rate of transcription and translation. Okay, and you remember what these processes are all about. Transcription is a process that takes place in the nucleus, basically where we transcribe, DNA into messenger RNA. And then that strand of messenger RNA is translated into a protein at a ribosome. Okay, and if it's done on a ribosome that's on the rough endoplasmic reticulum, you know that that's going to be more than likely exported out of the cell. And if it's done at a free ribosome within the systole of the cell, then that protein is more than likely just going to be used by the cell itself. Okay, for internal purposes. All right, so that's another way. So we increase the rate of amino acid transport into the cell, and we increase the amount of genetic material required to make proteins as well. And another thing you have to bear in mind that the average protein in size is about 25,000 amino acids in size. And for every amino acid produced, we have to burn one ATP molecule. That's a very, very taxing process. Making proteins is a taxing process. Okay, so there also is an increased rate of lipolysis. Okay, and there's an increased rate of fatty acid transport from lipocytes to cells. Okay, I should say to other cells. Okay, so remember that fat is, when it comes, 1 gram of fat has 9 calories worth of energy. Okay, 1 gram of carb, 1 protein, 4 calories as well. All right. So if we want to increase our production of a big complex molecule, we're going to want the best fuel source possible. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to increase our access to the best fuel source by increasing our access to fat. All right, so we'll increase this. So growth hormone stimulates the increased breakdown of fat from our lipocytes or our fat cells and increases the transport of them into, of that fat, throughout the bloodstream to other cells of the body. So free fatty acid levels in the bloodstream are going to rise as growth hormone levels rise in the body as well. And then they're going to, and then that fat is going to be taken up by the cells. Okay. So we increase our rate of a more efficient fuel, and then at the same time, what happens is we actually decrease glucose utilization. So essentially, growth hormone actually causes basically diabetic effects. Okay, it actually creates diabetic-like effects by increasing blood sugar concentration. So what it does is when I say decrease glucose utilization, I essentially mean decrease glucose transport into the cell. That's what I meant earlier when I said this is a glucose-sparing hormone. Okay, and as a result, so basically it kind of this counteracts the effect of insulin. Okay, so we become more reliant on fats as an energy source. All right, and then last but not least, the other way that we increase protein synthesis, pretty simple, is to decrease protein catabolism. Okay, oops. We decrease the rate at which we break down proteins. All right, so as a result, so basically, since growth hormone, and a reason why this might be is the effects that growth hormone has on fat, the breakdown on fat, that essentially cellular mechanisms will leave the proteins alone. Because remember, cellular responses are very specific to the chemical messages that are interacting with the cells. Okay, so as you can see, growth hormone has a lot of very strong metabolic effects on cells, on not just the growth of cells, but the metabolism of cells. Okay. Now, in saying this is important because, which this kind of leads me into the next topic. Growth hormone. Well, let's talk about one more little deal here. Growth hormone and cartilage. Okay, growth hormone and cartilage. Okay, essentially with growth hormone and cartilage, growth hormone, basically creates all the metabolic effects that we just produced, in chondrocytes as well. Increase protein synthesis. Okay, increase mitosis. All right, and increased rate of basically conversion of chondrocytes into osteogenic cells, which in turn increases the rate of bone growth, because these will become osteoblasts and so on and increase the rate of bone growth. Okay, because remember, what we're essentially focusing on here is a growth plate. Because remember, growth plates are filled with very active cells that divide, and then these cells work their way away, just like in skin, away from the very active center of the growth plate, and then they start to interact in the bone tissue. And if these become essentially more osteogenic cells, which can become osteoblasts, that can increase the overall length of a bone. Okay. Which is kind of interesting. Now, what happens when growth hormone interacts with these cells of the body, not just cartilage, but other cells of the body, one of the chemical messages that, one of the kind of the secondary messages that can be produced from this is something called, basically IGFs, insulin-like growth factors. Okay, and then these insulin-like growth factors basically do what we've been talking about, and increase the basically increase the activities of these cells, and some of them are also released into the blood, and one of them is somatomedin. Okay, somatomedin. Hence, remember we said earlier that the cells are somatotropes. Okay, this was one of the earlier studied, chemical messages that come as a result of growth hormone activity in the body. Okay, hence the term somatotrope, somatomedin, because somatomedin affects the regulation of the secretion of growth hormone. Okay, now, so let's kind of talk about that next topic, growth hormone. Where's the regulation slide? Growth hormone regulation. Okay, the regulation of growth hormone. Not a well understood process, but there's a couple things that we can talk about here. So basically, growth hormone is secreted in what's called a pulsatile fashion. Okay, pulsatile fashion. So basically, it's squirted out in certain amounts throughout the day. And the highest levels of growth hormone are going to be found basically about 2 hours into your deep sleep. 2 hours into your very deep sleep. Okay. The reason why it's important to get a good night's sleep. You guys ever notice this before? You go to bed and you just don't sleep well, or you decide to have 5, 10, 15, 20 too many beers, and you wake up the next day and you just feel bad even after the maybe the hangover wears off. All right, a big reason why you don't feel good is because if you don't sleep well, whether you're a restless sleeper, or your sleep levels are all off, or you tied on a few too many, okay, you're not going to secrete enough growth hormone in your sleep, more than likely, and then as a result, you're not going to allow your body to basically recover from the previous day. That's a very important key factor or function of growth hormone. All right, is that as we increase the secretion of this hormone when we're sleeping, this basically allows our cells and tissues to recover from the stresses of the previous day. Okay, by increasing the rate of protein synthesis and mitosis and so on. All right, and you're going to feel pretty cruddy. Okay, all right. So basically, so this is what I mean by the pulsatile fashion, that basically, as we say, and it'll be secreted a little bit throughout the day as well, but its highest levels are going to be about 2 hours into your deep sleep. And there are some other factors that increase the rate of growth hormone secretion as well. Okay, one is starvation. Two, hypoglycemia. 3, exercise. 4, excitement. 5 is going to be trauma. Okay, so starvation, hypoglycemia, exercise, and trauma. Starvation. Well, if we are starving, we need to burn more. We need to utilize our fuel sources, and if we're not consuming calories, we're going to need to burn calories, and we're going to increase the rate of our fat We're going to increase the rate of our fat metabolism. Okay, and eventually we're going to run out of that fuel source, and then we're going to be having some really bad problems because then we're going to start breaking down proteins. Hypoglycemia. Okay, we just said, even though the mechanisms aren't exactly well understood, this causes a, diabetic-like effects, high blood sugar. So, if our blood sugar levels are low, that could stimulate the release of growth hormone, and as a result, get our sugar levels up and counteract insulin. Exercise, this should make sense. If you're exercising, you're gonna, you are going to need to build, you're going to need to make your muscles larger, and your bones are going to grow, and then as a result, okay, in order to be able to handle and physiologically compensate for exercise, you're going to need to increase the size of your tissues and also recover from the trauma you put them through for the previous day. Excitement, excitement, that would make sense because if you get really excited or stressed, you're going to need more fuel in your system. Okay, more fuel in your system, and to handle this. And trauma. If you damage your tissues, you're going to need to repair your tissues. Okay, you're definitely going to need to repair your tissues. Now, when it comes to starvation, the starvation aspect is, primarily, especially in extreme protein deficiency. Okay, extreme protein deficiency. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of a disease called kwashiorkor. This is a disease that you find in populations where access to food is not that great. And what people look like that have this is they have very, very thin limbs, and then they have very round abdomens. Okay, and the reason why their limbs are so thin is because they're so starved, especially of protein. I mean, if you're not consuming protein, you're going to have to get it from somewhere, and you're going to get it from yourself. You got it, and what better source of protein than to basically eat the meat that's in you, break down muscle tissue. Okay, and then what's going to and basically, if your protein levels are going to be low, your plasma protein levels are also going to be low. Okay, especially a plasma protein called albumin. And as your albumin levels get low, you're going to have a harder time retaining H2O in the blood, retaining water in the blood. And then a lot of that water is going to spill out into the abdomen, and then it's just going to sit there, and then that's what causes those people to have those skinny arms and legs and the large bellies. Okay, so, and then basically it's been shown that in kwashiorkor that growth hormone levels rise substantially in order to compensate for this. And then basically as you increase, and this is a very fixable problem, all you do is you start to, you increase their protein intake, and you'll not only see this slowly start to reverse itself, you'll also see the growth hormone levels start to drop as well. All right, and then that the hypothalamus also is responsible for regulating the activity of growth hormone, and that the hypothalamus, releases a releasing hormone called growth hormone releasing hormone. Okay, and this then increases the activity of the somatotropes, and then in turn increases growth hormone production. Okay, and then essentially what's going to happen is, remember, this is regulated through negative feedback. Then what's going to happen as growth hormone levels rise, or as we increase the levels of somatomedins, or IGFs, those are essentially going to be the negative feedback mechanisms that are going to shut off the release of this releasing hormone. Okay, and then growth hormone levels will then drop. Okay, so that essentially is hormone regulation. And then last but not least, I just want to talk a little bit about some growth hormone abnormalities. So it's relatively simple then. If you understand that this hormone is responsible for growth, then basically what you're going to see is people are either going to be very large, they're going to be very short, or this is an interesting one that falls in the middle. Okay, now gigantism essentially occurs, you see this with children. You also see dwarfism with children. This is an adult disorder. Okay, this is an adult disorder, and the common denominator with these two is growth plates or epiphyseal plates. Okay, so basically these two conditions are caused by increased growth hormone levels. This particular condition is caused by decreased growth hormone levels. Okay. So basically, if children have, if growth hormone levels skyrocket in children and they have active growth plates, their bones are going to lengthen a lot, and then they're going to grow to be very tall. They're going to be 7 feet 10, 7'8", 7'10", 8 feet tall. Okay, and vice versa. If a child is a pituitary dwarf, there are other forms of dwarfism out there. Okay, if a child is a pituitary dwarf, then there's going to be low activity of the growth plates, and they're not going to reach, obviously not reach their peak height. They're going to be very short, but they're going to be very proportional in size. Their arms are going to match the size. Their arms and legs are going to match be proportional to their torso and their head. Okay, whereas there's another form of dwarfism out there called achondroplasia, or achondroplastic dwarfs. Okay, and this is a problem where the growth plates fuse because they ossify too soon. And then what happens is these achondroplastic dwarfs have a normal or adult size head and torso, but very short limbs. Okay, and then what you're going to see is you're going to see acromegaly-like effects, which we can see here. Okay, now the reason so if an adult has a pathology, for example, a tumor on their pituitary that's causing them to secrete excessive growth hormone, you got to remember once we get to about our depending on usually gender and age and so on, but females and males are going to stop growing in height in their 30s, in their 20s. Okay, women usually by the time they get to their 20s, and men usually once they get to about their mid-20s. Okay, so now once those growth plates ossify, they're unable to grow. The bones are unable to grow in length, but that doesn't mean they can't grow in diameter and girth. Okay, so then what you're going to see then is acro means extremities. You're going to see the extremities enlarge. Okay, so what you can see here is this particular individual at age 28, age 49, age 55. What do you notice? Okay, you notice that his face is becoming more elongated. Okay, but this person is not going to grow in height. What else? So you can see right here. This is an X-ray of an individual with acromegaly. Notice the increased length of the mandible here. Size of the cranium and so on. And then here, you also notice the size of the hands. Acro, remember, is extremities. The hands and feet are going to enlarge as well. Okay, this is an average size hand, and then these are an individual with acromegaly. All right. So after seeing these images and me talking about this, think about Barry Bonds for a second. Because I can tell you right now, as much as he whines and cries about being innocent and being picked on, he's guilty. Any first-year anatomy student, not medical student, but just an anatomy student, you know, an undergraduate anatomy student can realize that not just him, but these other athletes are stone cold guilty of pumping themselves full of growth hormone. Okay, and he's a very good example. This Sylvester Stallone is actually also a pretty good example of this as well. But he at least, you know, well, he was hiding it, but at least he admitted it when he got busted that he was using an illegal form of growth hormone. He was trying to get it out to Australia to work out with it to look big and buff for his upcoming Rocky movie and also the new Rambo movie that he came out with a few years ago. Okay, so basically here's kind of an overview of growth hormone. Here's where I got these images from. So I appreciate Dr. Kumagai from the University of Michigan for allowing the use of these. But, you know, so here's growth hormone, and then in another video, since I kind of stressed this one out, I will talk about the effects of the other pituitary hormones. I should say in other videos. This is going to take me a couple videos to hit on those as well.